All right, so we're going to be talking about point-to-point design today, using the Mach 1 to essentially pick different points out in space to create your designs. And really what we're going to be focusing on is how to use that universal arm and the exact center point of that tool, whether you have a marker on it, your torch, the scribe tip that comes with the Mach 1, and essentially picking off points in space to create your designs that can later be cut with the Mach 1. So to do this, we're first going to take our tablet, we're going to navigate to design, and at the bottom left, point to point. So in this mode, you can see as long as your arms are unlocked, you're going to be able to move them around, and your Mach 1 machine is going to follow on the tablet so you can see where your arms are moving at all times. If your arms are locked, which is that button on the right, you're not going to be able to move the arms, so just make sure that they are unlocked and you have a good grasp of where your machine is moving. There's a few different options here on the left. You've got circle, path, freehand trace, and clear. So what we're going to start out with is a simple 2-point line that we're going to draw out with the Mach 1 and then show you how this in its simplest form can work. So let's say I wanted to make a line with the Mach 1 from right here at this point. So the center point of where this marker is, I'm going to say path, line, start point, and then I'm going to move that tool to a different point, and I'm going to click endpoint. And as you see, a line pops up on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and click end here, and we're just going to show how you can make a quick line using the Mach 1. You're going to also want to go to the place step and set pretty much any arbitrary origin. The Mach 1 doesn't actually uh, move the point-to-point parts when you're in the place step. We'll cover that in a later video. So I'm just going to set an arbitrary point in place so that machine has its bearings in that place step. Then we're going to go to materials, and we're going to just make sure that all these boxes on the left are green. Since we're doing a dry run, this won't matter too much, but I'm going to just say we're using acetylene, Kawiki. We have a double-aught tip, and I'm going to set my material thickness and type. Before going to the last step run, just go ahead and cut this part out. So I'll take my marker off, lower down this marker a little bit here, and then I'll click start just so you can see how it's going to go from this point to the end point that we just traced. And then I'm going to speed this up. And so that's pretty much the basics of how you can create a line using point to point. Now we're going to go ahead and clear that, and then we're going to show you how you can stitch lines together to create another path. So I'll go to design. We're going to go back to point to point. I've already cleared my design here, but I'll just clear again just to make sure. And now I'll go to path, and I'm going to say I want to make a line. I'm going to move the torch to that first part that I want to cut. I'll say we're going to start right here. I'm going to move it to an endpoint over there. And now if I click line again, it's going to give me the option to enter another endpoint. And essentially what I'm doing is stitching a couple of different lines together. So let's say you were trying to clear off some wasted material or something like that. You could stitch lines together, and I'm going to say end again. And you can either just end this path and leave it open, or you can close the shape. So I'm going to say close shape. And what it does is it connects that first line to the last line. And now this is going to be treated as a closed shape. And what that means is right now it's shaded. If I went here and tapped on it, I could click. I actually want to pierce on the outside. I could change the scale. I could add radius to it, rotate it, things like that. So essentially your closed paths, you're going to have a couple different more options just because you've closed it. So now it treats it whether you can pierce on the inside or outside. So I'm not going to run this cut, just showing you how you can stitch a couple different lines together. So I'm going to go ahead and clear. And now I'm going to actually load in a DXF file of a few different arcs to show you how we're going to actually pick up arcs in space and load them on to the Mach 1 with point to point as well. to generate any arc, you really only need 3 points: the start point, the end point, and some other middle point along that path. So it doesn't have to be the exact middle point of the arc, but as long as it's between the start and end points, that's enough to constrain the arc in a way that there's only one possible solution. So I'm going to show you here how we can trace all three of these arcs using point to point and create them so we can actually trace them as if they were off of a normal part and not something we just drew up in the CAD file. So I'm going to go to arc, and this time I'm going to use my scribe point. I'm going to lower down my tip here, and I'm going to say my start point is right there. I'm going to move my torch to a different point along the middle. So you can see it doesn't really matter exactly what point it is as long as it's a middle point along the arc. I'm going to say middle point, and then we'll go over to end point. So you'll notice that it doesn't really matter the height of the torch while you're creating your paths. It really just matters where it is on the 2D plane. So that's my first arc completed. I'll go to my second arc after I click end on that first one. And this time I'm going to start at this path. We'll say arc, start point. I'm going to select the middle point. Again, not necessarily the middle. It can be, but doesn't have to be. And then I'll say end point right there. We'll end that arc. And finally, we'll do this last arc out this way. So say path, arc, start point, middle point, and end point. I'll end that one. And now I'll just show you that based off of just picking off those different arcs in space, different middle points, different start points, we're going to have all three of these arcs pretty much traced over almost exactly how we drew them. So since I've already set my place and my materials, I can just go right back into run. Now I can click start. It's going to go to that first point. And what you notice here is it's only as good as the points that you give it. So essentially, it's going to create this arc out in space based on that start point, the end point, the middle point. And so it's pretty critical that if you're trying to trace something super precise, just move it into the exact location of the start and end points, and make sure you're selecting good middle point so that it can fully constrain that arc. So hopefully that was helpful on exactly how to define arcs in the point-to-point space. Now I'm going to go back to point-to-point. I'm going to clear this design, and now we're going to try to stitch a lot of it together. We'll make a path using arcs and lines. So let's say here I wanted to make a line. I'm going to start it right there. We'll do an endpoint. Now I'm going to select arc. And since I already know the starting point of my arc was the end point of my line, since I'm making one continuous path, I'm just going to move it to a middle point and then an end point. And you'll see there that's constrained it and added a line and added an arc to my line so I can make one continuous path. So I can add another line. I can do another arc. And you can do this as much as necessary to create any part using just the different points on the start and end points of your lines. So once you do that, you can also close the shape again. And now this is another part that we could cut out. So now we're going to really wrap it up all together. We're going to take a cardboard template of a bucket part that we had from a customer. We're going to lay that out here, and then we're going to use the scribe tip to pick off the start points and end points for all the lines and arcs and show you how you can recreate real parts in real time. All right. So this is a real bucket part that our customer has made in the past, and we essentially just made a template of it. And you can see that's the side there. It's a coupler for a bucket. So we're going to use this part to trace out on the Mach 1. So now that we have this part all ready to trace, we're going to swap to our scribe tip. And like I said, we're essentially selecting the middle point of the scribe. So since it comes down to a nice fine point, it's going to give us a pretty good reference on selecting the edge points of all these different arcs and lines. And essentially, we're going to stitch all these together to recreate this part. So quick tip for recreating a part like this is you're going to want to start on likely a corner. So essentially, when your start and end line are almost ready to be completed, we can actually close that path on top of each other. So what I mean by that is if I start at this point here, I can create all my different lines and arcs and go around. And when I get to this endpoint right here, I can just click close path, and it's going to stitch the end of this line to that line, and it's going to actually close it so that then I can go back in and tell it it's an outside cut, and to cut it with a little bit of kerf offset so that the final dimensions are where we want them. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. We're going to go to this first point. I'm going to line it up. I'm going to say path, line, start point, move to the corner here, and say endpoint, line, endpoint, line, endpoint, line, endpoint. We're going to come over to the rough start of this arc, which looks to be about right here. And now I'm going to say line, endpoint, and that's going to be the start of my arc. So now I can just select a middle point along that arc. So we'll move it to the right about there and say arc, middle point, and then the end point of my arc, which would be right about there. We'll do the same thing for the arc start over here. And we'll say line, endpoint, arc, middle point, and then we'll say the arc's endpoint right there. Go back to this line. And say line, endpoint. Will be another line. Endpoint, another line. Endpoint. And then I'll just do a sharp corner here. Another line to right about there. And then we'll do an arc for this inside diameter. We'll close that arc. And then now, as you noticed from the first part of this tracing, this was actually my start point. So I can actually move my torch over here and just make sure that was actually my start point. And now I can just say close shape, and it's going to connect these two dots together, essentially give me my full path. So that's my closed shape. And as I mentioned, I'm going to now call that an outside cut so that it knows to pierce on the outside. And then I'm going to now select essentially the circles where those pinholes are going to be. And I'm going to take the center diameter point of those circles to add those into this design on top of that outside profile. So to do that, I'm just going to navigate to the center point of those circles. I'm going to make sure it's lined up. You can do some more complex marking and layout to make sure you're picking the exact right center point, but what I'm going to do is just give it a circle. The diameter is 2 inches. And then I'm going to go pick it up and move to that other circle center point. Do the same thing, where essentially I'm just going to make sure I'm pretty much in the center. And add my other circle. And now this is pretty much my entire closed path. So now that I have this shape all made up, I'm going to start out by just showing you how you can cut this in place pretty much exactly where it was traced in the point-to-point mode. And then we'll get into intricacies of how you could actually rotate this part and move it to a different place in case you wanted to trace it in one position and then move it somewhere else to actually cut it out with respect to where the machine is. So as it turns out, the circles are actually 2.5 inches. And if I wanted to go back in and modify those pins, I can just tap on the outside of the circle and I can just modify the diameter until it's 2.5 inches. I'll do the same for the other circle. And it's going to keep the same center point. It's just going to increase the diameter. So pretty easy to come in and make adjustments if you misdimension something or need to create a larger or smaller diameter after you place the circle down. So now we're going to take this part off the table and we're just going to trace it in place where it is. So we'll put the marker on. We'll go back to run. And you'll see here, when I go back into the run panel, it's actually going to show me where my pierce points are going to be. So for these shaded circles, since I had them selected as inside shapes, the pierce is going to be on the inside. And then for my outer path, which I called it an outside shape, that's why we closed it, it's going to show it as an outside cut. So this will offset the kerf of the torch so that you're ending with the final dimensions that you were really looking for. And now we can go ahead and just click start and cut this thing out. All right, so let's see how we did. We're gonna go ahead and overlay the part over this. So as I mentioned, this is only gonna be as good as the points that you give it, but based on this layout, looks like we did pretty good tracing it. And that's exactly what you're looking for if you're trying to create parts really quickly out in the field or in the shop, not having to go to a CAD file and try to take tape measurement dimensions off things. So that is essentially the basics of tracing a point-to-point part. And as I mentioned, this is how we're going to cut it in place. So now that we have this design traced up in point-to-point, we're going to want to save it as is first, essentially so that when we load it up back again, it's going to be saved in that point-to-point mode. So we'll call this bucket part in point to point. And I'll say save. And then I'm going to go back to point, and I'm going to touch and hold anywhere on the screen here. And this group shapes option is going to come up. So now I'm going to select the edge of the different parts. So we'll do the outer profile, the circles, and then we'll say create group. Now that everything is grouped up together, when I re-tap into that group, I now have this option that says convert to drawing. And what this is going to let me do is essentially take this part out of the point-to-point trace mode and place it into my classic design mode. And we'll cover this in some later topics and videos, but essentially what that's going to let us do is when we go back into place, now when I move that part around and I move the origin of my design, I'm going to be moving everything that's in that classic design mode. So I'm going to go ahead and save it as the classic design. So we'll say bucket part classic. I'm going to say save. And also, if I wanted to save this to a flash drive, I have that same option. So as you see here, I could say save to flash drive. And what this will let you do is take those points in the DXF file that we've just created and save it to the flash drive on the back of your machine. So you can pull it back into CAD, make more adjustments if you need to offset different things or add more radius, things like that. So you can also have that option to modify it on your computer as well. So that essentially wraps up the point-to-point mode tutorial. We're going to now show you the classic design mode and how we can bring all this together.